Hello, my name is Luke Maldonado. This is our data science midterm project on life expectancy. For question one of the project, we looked at cleaning up the data table. So originally we had two rows called economy status and developed and economy status developing. And the goal was to combine these two rows into one, these two columns into a new column just called status. And the goal of this was to kind of just clean up the data and make it easier to read and interpret. As you can see on the left-hand side before, there were two separate columns and it was labeled 0 and 1 to determine whether it was developed or developing. That's just kind of confusing, and once you combine the columns into the new status column, it just makes it easier to understand and read. For question two, we looked at the relationship between schooling and GDP per capita, and basically just took those two columns from the table and put them on a scatter plot. And as you can see, there is a relationship between the amount of schooling that's required in a country and how much the GDP per capita uh, of the average citizen of the country. You can see a correlation there that countries that have more schooling tend to have a higher GDP per capita. But you can still see a lot of countries where they have like 10 years of required schooling are still like very low down there, which I think is very interesting. Many people are still at or below the poverty line. I think this kind of shows that even with schooling in our system now, people are still struggling. And then for question three, we looked at three different life expectancy, like average quality of life things, which is life expectancy, infant mortality or infant deaths, and deaths under 5. And as you can see, from the year 2000 to 2015, life expectancy has gone up. Infant deaths have gone down, and deaths under 5 have also gone down. I think this is so it's a very important thing that even though this data takes into account every country in the world, and it shows that even developing countries are making progress and improving quality of life and getting the infant mortality rate lower.
For question four, I looked at whether bigger populations deal with more severe healthcare issues like HIV deaths and adult mortality. First, I filtered the data set to only the columns needed, population, HIV deaths, and adult mortality, and grouped the numbers by region so the patterns would be easier to see. The graph I made shows that high population countries often have higher HIV deaths and mortality, but population size alone isn't the main cause. What really stands out is that region and economic status make a much bigger difference. Africa and South Asia, which tend to both have large populations and limited healthcare resources, show much higher mortality. Meanwhile, regions with smaller populations but stronger health systems, like Europe and the Western Pacific, maintain low mortality regardless of population size. So the takeaway is population plays a role, but inequality in healthcare access is the real driver. For question five, I analyze vaccination coverage for hepatitis B, polio, and measles across different regions. I grouped the data by region and calculated the average vaccination rate for each vaccine. Then I created a group chart to compare regions side by side. The results were clear. Europe and the Western Pacific had the highest vaccination coverage by far, while Africa and the Southeast and Southeast Asia had the lowest. This pattern follows broader economic trends. Regions with higher GDP and higher average years of schooling also have stronger public health systems and more consistent vaccine access. The graph really highlights global inequality in disease prevention. In question six, I focused on health, specifically infant mortality and under 5 mortality. I grouped countries by region again and computed the average mortality rates. The graph shows the same pattern I saw earlier. Africa has extremely high infant and under 5 mortality, while Europe and the Western Pacific have the lowest. This reinforces the idea that a country's wealth and healthcare investment directly impact child survival. So overall, child mortality turns out to be one of the clearest indicators of inequality across regions. For question seven, I grouped countries into GDP buckets, from low income to high income. I then calculated the average mortality for each group and plotted it. This one produced one of the strongest trends in the whole project. The higher GDP, the lower the infant and under 5 mortality. The lowest GDP group had extremely high child mortality, while high GDP nations had very low child mortality. This trend lines up with everything I saw earlier. Wealthier countries have better schooling, better vaccination rates, and more stable healthcare systems. Together, these help children survive and thrive. So GDP ends up being one of the most powerful predictors of child health outcomes.
For question 8, I compare adult mortality between developed and developing countries using a side-by-side dark bar chart. And I plot three developed countries on the left side and three developing countries on the right side. And I use the same scale for a fair comparison. And the bar chart shows each country's contribution to total mortality across years. And the virtual just immediately shows the developed countries have a lower and more stable mortality rate, and the developing country have a higher and more variety pattern, which is clear evidence showing that economic stature will impact our healthy outcome. And for question 9, the central question I investigated was how does a region's MBI relate to the healthy outcome of its population, which is measured by the life expectancy. And so I find the average life expectancy of each region and their MBI. And then I made a scatter plot. And the scatter plot shows a positive correlation. And what's really interesting is just region with high life expectancy has a higher MBI, like in general, but which we normally think higher MBI is worse. So that's one thing I found like really interesting. And for question 10, I just find the alcohol consumption with schooling, and I want to figure out its correlation. So I just find that there is a positive correlation between schooling and average alcohol consumption. It revolves like indicate the population with higher like long year schooling have a more alcohol consumption, and the scatter plot just showing that it has a very strong positive correlation. It's 0.39. And this relationship is just likely reflect that the social economics fact that where higher education is correlated to higher income and different lifestyle pattern and different drinking cultures.